Hi, everybody. Hi, Maxine.
Hi.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. I mean, this is the third try.
Yep.
But I feel like the weather is really cooperating with us today.
Yes,
it's perfect.
there's no chance of rain.
Yes, we've checked obsessively. So thank you, everybody, for being here. It's nice to, I feel like we're all friends. I feel like I've seen so many familiar faces. So thank you for coming out and being here with us today to kick off your book tour and celebrate this incredible book that I think is already changing conversations in the fashion industry. We're gonna dive in a little bit and talk about some key things about the book and get your thoughts on some questions that I have as well, because I've read the book 2 times so far. And then we're going to hear a little bit about like what does it take to make change in the industry, which I think is so critically important. Should we dive in?
Let's do it.
Okay, cool. Awesome. So you took us on a journey around the world to China, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, the US, pretty much following the journey of a pair of jeans. And one thing that really kind of stood out for me was that you said you're not somebody who typically rocks the boat, that you're not somebody who's typically an advocate for things. And I really think that you're not just rocking the boat with this book, you're like making waves in the entire ocean. How did you go from selling things, to sell clothing, to being in a place where you're launching NSI and you're writing this incredible book?
Well, thank you, Tabitha, for the question, and thank you, everybody, for being here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm incredibly intimidated right now, and I am very rarely intimidated because you are many people, you can't hear me, okay, that I know and care deeply about. So I'm very moved that you are all here and that, Tabitha, you are doing this with me. So to answer your question, yeah, as we were talking, kind of planning this conversation, I wouldn't say that I was like born this advocate. And I even remember a friend of mine from high school when I came back, my friend Asa, he's like, "This is not what I expected out of you." And to me that's important because like I was a pretty basic girl. My sister, who is right here, I had like highlights in my hair in high school, and she's like, "That's very Blake," which was our high school. It was not a compliment at the time. But I think, there were just things that I saw along the way. Like, quite simply, it just seemed unfair. And so I don't think there's anything unique about me or my background. I think it's just when you are exposed to the injustices that I got to be exposed to, it's like, how could one not be moved by that? And I guess that's like pretty profoundly shaped like how I think also about social change, which is that, there's a lot of, I feel like, judgment around like, oh, people don't really care, or they, it's not like they pretend to care and then they really don't. And I have to believe, given my own experience, that if you're exposed to the injustices that you see and you're exposed to the problems of our world, that we're humans, like we would care. So yeah, I guess that's how I got into it. It wasn't like any aha or epiphany moment. Like it was just seeing, like uncovering these things and seeing these things. Like I don't want to live in a world that is like that.
Was there a moment when you were selling things where you sort of felt like this is not the path, this is not how I want to be in the world?
Yeah, so I think, I kind of trace it back. First, Zadie wasn't like just selling stuff to sell stuff. It was always with a very strong mission behind it. And, when we were in college together, we were very much sold about this idea of the social enterprise. And like that was the solution to things, was like through business. Everything, you change the world through business. And like that was kind of the neoliberal like framework that was sold to us in college and through law school, which is ironic that in law school we were taught that business changes things when we were studying law, which is what actually changes things. And so I very much like went in, the startup Zadie was this social enterprise, and I remember when we were raising money for Zadie, can you hear me now? I feel like there's concern. Yes. Okay, no, great.
It's all good. You're doing great.
Okay, thank you. When we were raising money for Zadie, I remember like we sold it as, we would say like, oh, our parents' generation, they marched, but we're smarter than that. Like we know that that's not how change happens, and like it happens through business. Like, and I cringe now that I think about, that was, the idea that we were sold, that was how things change. And then it was through Zadie that I remember working with Jacqueline, and we would just say like, wait, if we could just stop selling clothes and just focus on the social change, like how much more we could actually do. And so it became that like uncovering that is like, wait a minute, actually even if we do create the very best product, that's not gonna move the whole entire industry. That's not gonna move things in the kind of structural way that we really need to move them. It was an evolution.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Why a pair of jeans?
Yeah, so this was a process that many in the audience were actually a part of. When I was thinking about like clothing and the story of clothing, to me, we thought of, should we do focus on like athleisure, because like that was a very trendy thing, and to me jeans is this iconic piece that we almost all have in our closet. You're wearing jeans, my husband's wearing jeans, you are wearing, there's a lot of it. And they represent so much, and historically represented so much of like what America was supposed to be. And they were exported, into Eastern Europe in the fall of the Soviet Union as like this freedom pants, basically. And so they represent so much of what America is supposed to be, but the truth behind them is so much darker than that kind of idealized vision. The truth of jeans is the story of cotton. It is the story of slavery. It is the story of the most extreme forms of capitalism. The once local story of denim has now become a global story of exploitation. And so that, it's a product that we all have. It cuts across socioeconomic, status, and it tells the story of the world in this product that we mostly all have.
And I think the story of jeans is also a testament to how the industry sort of intentionally creates a disconnect between what goes into making clothing, what goes into making a pair of jeans, and the people behind it, and also the end product. Because I think it's been democratized in terms of the aesthetic, but when you look at behind the scenes, there's a whole lot to sort of unpack. So you note in the book, mostly male executives make enormous sums of money on the back of mostly women's work and women's purchasing. And the fashion industry is one that is really held up and continues to exist off of the labor of mostly women, particularly women of color, I think, when you look at the people who are the laborers and so forth. Can you share some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's just the facts of the matter. Is like when, I think for a lot of reasons, and misogyny is one of them, our hadn't up until quite recently thought of fashion as this serious industry. And so it kind of was under the radar. It wasn't covered in the same way that other industries of similar impact are covered, with the same scrutiny. It's kind of all the fun and the glitz and the glamour of it was covered, but not the the exploitation and the wealth accumulation. And I think the other side of that is it's a lot of private wealth, a lot of private companies. But if you just, look at the Forbes billionaire list, there are a lot of people from the fashion industry that are there, and they are all white men. And so I do like to, it is such a critical part of the story is to see that it's not just exploited labor, it's exploited women's labor, it's exploited women's labor of color, and it's exploited domestic labor as well. And I think that's the other part of the story that I really wanted to get, is that it's both the exploitation of garment workers, but the part of it that actually kind of surprised me the most in doing the research in the book was actually going to the Amazon workers, who, for, again, going back to the story of cotton, are disproportionately people of color as well. And their actual jobs, like their day-to-day lives might be different, but their daily jobs are not dissimilar. The Amazon distribution worker and a garment worker, in that they are both being expected to operate like machines until they will one day be replaced by them. And then to go back and look in history, that this mechanized labor, this idea that you count every moment of a movement, this kind of mechanized industrial labor, that was first explored and kind of worked on in the cotton fields. So the roots of our current fashion system are still very deeply rooted to slavery. And there's just that's just a fact. I don't know.
I mean, you bring up Amazon, and we just saw there was a huge attempt to for the workers to actually unionize. What do you think is the role of unions in advocating for resolving some of these labor issues?
Yeah, there was there's a lot of, I did a lot of thinking about unions, because I think unions get, we think about them in a domestic context, and then we think about them in an international context, but we rarely think about those pieces together. And and I didn't come knowing a lot about labor and organized labor going into the research for the book. And so I remember grappling with Jennifer. I don't actually see you, Jennifer. Oh, sorry, right in front of me. We grappled a lot with this, because we would hear these stories of the factory owners, in Texas saying, if you brought a union, if there was attempts to unionize, then our prices would go up and those jobs would just disappear. And he had a very good case study of a company called Farah, which was a huge domestic garment producer down in Texas, and they unionized, and it bankrupted the company because the competitors could just go elsewhere for cheaper labor. So I was so then are unions bad? No, unions aren't bad. Unions, there's also very strong evidence that unions are one of the single biggest driver of wage increases, and a big driver of ability to close the race wage gap. So it's okay, well, they're definitely good. But that's why then you have to really see these things from a global perspective, and why we both have to strengthen unions domestically and strengthen domestic union laws. But we also, and this is putting my lawyer hat on, we have to incorporate labor in our trade deals, so that we can't just build up strong labor movement here and then companies just offshore and exploit workers somewhere else. That's just a game of whack-a-mole then. We have to both strengthen the domestic laws and incorporate stronger labor within our trade agreements. And I think that's just a really important thing for people to realize, is it's not we have to do this through the UN or through some international body. We can create these laws through our trade deals. We can create them domestically, but we can't think of like unions isolate in an isolated way, otherwise they won't be successful.
And I think that's one thing that you really spoke about at length in the book, is how interconnected all of this really is, and that we can't be in the US and think that the choices that we're making and the ways in which we do or don't advocate for workers in the US, like it really impacts people all over the world, just because of the power, I think, of this country and our footprint in the fashion industry.
Did I have one thing to say?
Yes.
Because I had another conversation, people are like, well, we have to worry about not just what's happening in the US, but like what's happening elsewhere, which of course we do, and like there's a lot of American exceptionalism where we think what we do matters more than anything. But we do export our culture. And, you know, one of the like kind of aha moments that I had was in Ghana, in the secondhand markets in Contamanto, in Accra, the secondhand market. The shop seller's name is David, and David was telling me, like, Maxine, you know, he was talking about how he sells both like in the market and then on Instagram as well. And he said, like, he had somebody DM him a picture of what Beyonce wore, like, at an event, like, days prior, and asked, like, can you get me that dress? And that was just, like, I don't know, such an aha moment for me. It was like, oh, we are creating this, like, sense of disposable fashion, and we think that it's just, like, our own issue, but we are exporting that whole notion around the world. And so we do, like, America, and I think influencers and celebrities play a very significant role in drivers of culture and, like, reining in this whole concept of disposability.
I think that's so key, and I also think that we have this way of just linking everything back to capitalism that is really worrying, and I almost wonder, like, I don't have a solution for it, but I know that it's definitely not the way that we want to go, because I think you're absolutely right. The way that we all that things exist in this country, it has a ripple effect all over the world. I think about the secondhand clothing industry that's become something that's become so mainstream in the last couple of years. I had my own reckoning last year. You and I were talking about this, where I started shopping for secondhand clothing at the Real Real, and then I realized, but I'm still shopping way more than I need to be shopping. I don't need these clothes, even though it's secondhand clothing. Like, I actually don't need these things. So even in this habit of, like, reusing clothing, we've managed to do it within the context of capitalism and make it into something that's now become super mainstream and is actually having, I mean, I'm curious what you think about that. I think some of it is having the opposite effect of making us more conscious about our clothing, but I'm curious to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, these secondhand models are great models, right? Like, it's good that we have this, you know, that this has become more popular, and that it's, you know, the next generation, like, if you are not shopping secondhand, you're not cool. Like, I think that's a great development. But what I do agree with you that there was a research paper that I came across in researching for the book, and it wasn't about clothing, but it was about paper towel use in a bathroom. I get to mention this. And there was, and the study is that there was one where the paper towel, like, had a recycling sign on it, and there was another where the paper towel dispenser did not have a recycling sign. And the one that had the recycling sign, people used more paper towel because they thought, you know, that it was going to be recycled. And so there is that kind of, in law we would call that moral hazard, that, like, if we think that we can have a second life and it doesn't have an impact, then we'll actually just do that activity even more. And I do, I think that we should be, with, you know, go into these models with our eyes wide open, that it is something like, we, like, there's no research, there's scant research on, like, how often people are wearing their clothing. And, like, if we don't know that basic information, and the surveys that there's 2 surveys that were out of the UK. One was that women consider their clothing old 1 in 3 women consider their clothing old after wearing them once or twice. And then the other one was that the average woman in the UK is wearing their clothing only 7 times before getting rid of it. It's like, we really need to zero in and like actually get the data and know, are these movements moving the needle or are they not? Because, you know, the planet doesn't care about like our fun new business models. Like it only cares about the impact decline.
And that brings it back to something that you said in the book, which I thought is actually one of the more controversial things that you said in the book. There's a lot of controversial things that she says in the book, for those who haven't read it. But it is the fact that there is really no such thing as sustainable fashion. And there's so many sustainable fashion lines out there, some more innovative than others. But I'm curious to hear if you could sort of expand on that a little bit.
Sure. When NSI posted that to Instagram, we got a lot of heat. But it's not to belittle, like it's hard because it's not to belittle the really hard work and important, you know, advancements that companies are working on. You know, we need that. We need to encourage that. But the point of saying there's no such thing as sustainable fashion is when we use those words, it becomes about, oh, I just need to choose between the sustainable fashion thing and then everything else. And so it's wrong for 2 reasons. One is that we're not growing trees, so it's not going to be like, it will always be resource intensive. It's just a matter of degrees of reduction of that intensity. And when we kind of create this dichotomy of, you know, all in with labeling something sustainable, is that it removes the most important part of the reduction of resources, which is how often are you actually wearing that garment. And so that's why it's, to me, so important to just, you know, change that framework, that there is no such thing as sustainable fashion. There is reduced impact. You know, there is fashion that is working to reduce impact compared to, you know, an average garment. It's not as sexy thing to say, but that's the fact of it. And I think we need to go back to the facts of things so that we can actually not just have these things be marketing tools, but actually drive the resource reduction that we need to live on this planet.
I think that's so important to note. I spoke on a panel a couple of weeks ago. I think it was the Fashion Revolution panel, where somebody asked a question about advice I would give to young fashion students. And I was like, really think carefully about if what you are producing in the world, if you want to start a new fashion line, think about if it's actually solving a problem, and is it really necessary? Do we really need more stuff in this world? And I think that's an important question for fashion schools to also be asking, to also be having the teachers really encourage the students to ask themselves when they're thinking about what their career is going to look like.
Yeah, absolutely. And Whitney, where are you, Whitney? Sorry, hold on. Why? Was that 2 years ago? I feel like 2 years ago, Whitney wrote a piece on, I forget the title of it, but it was about how, do we need more sustainable fashion? And it was funny because, Whitney was the first one that just, put it in those very, stark terms. And even I, at the time, I was like, well, I mean, I'm happy the conversation has evolved since then. But yeah, I think we do just have to, I think it's hard because in fashion we want to be so encouraging. But I do think that, I completely agree with you that the schools, have to take on that responsibility. And it's not just in the fashion schools. I was speaking to somebody that was an environmental scientist, and he was talking about kind of the coursework that they do. And, he was saying, well, we have to both kind of explain the problem, but we're training them for jobs too. And I thought that was really hard, because it was like, okay, so you're gonna, and he was even defining it as something that might be contradictory. So I do think it's it's these bigger kind of elephant in the room questions that we need to just zero in on and like get used to feeling uncomfortable. Like we don't actually have the answer. We don't know what to do, but we're never going to get there if we don't start kind of in that murky area.
Yeah. And that's where we need innovation and new ideas, is really around solving these problems. And I think that it's one of the big sort of problems that you speak of is really our relationship to being consumers and to consumerism. And you introduced somebody in the book that I actually didn't know about. His name is Edward Bernays, who is a really pivotal figure in terms of our relationship to stuff. And his strategy was actually, it's not, wait, have I not been speaking into the mic the whole time?
I think you sound great.
Okay. His strategy is, it's not that you think you need a piece of clothing, but that you will feel better if you have a piece of clothing. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so that was our favorite chapter of the whole book, was this zeroing in on Edward Bernays. And like, I don't know, when I first discovered this whole, like this man and this whole era, I was like, everybody, you must read this. You must watch this video on this man. Because like Edward Bernays is very much like the Mad Men era, and he was the father of public relations. He developed the term, and he before that worked on was part of the U.S. administration during World War I in propaganda, the propaganda department. And he said, well, I came back and I realized, like, because of the war, propaganda didn't have, like, a good vibe, so I didn't use the word vibe, whatever. So he came up with the term public relations. And like, the marketing tools that the marketing industry still uses today, like, he created. So he represented celebrities, and he represented films, and he represented product. And so he developed the concept of, like, placing product in films to then sell, which is like exactly when Jeff Bezos was like, why do you have a film studio? He's like, it helps us sell heels. And so that's like still very much, you know, the thread going through today. But not only was it the kind of the Mad Men era part that was just crazy, but it was deeply anti-democratic. And it was this idea that there was this fear of the masses and the fear of what they might do, which was like, fine, I get it. He was a Jewish person just coming out of World War II, so like he had reason to fear the masses. But like, what a massive unintended consequence of that kind of logic, where you fear the masses and to satiate, and that's what he's used those words, to satiate the masses, to distract them from actually being involved in democracy, you sell them stuff. And that's like what we have become, are these like consuming machines. And it was like these quotes that these people say, it almost sounds fake, except that they are like, I've listened to it with my own ears. But it, you know, it was very much designed from marketers with finance and with people in government to actively get people to see themselves as consumers first and citizens second, third, fourth, or fifth. So like actively not get involved with government, and like I don't know, it makes then a lot more sense of where we are today.
Yeah, and I think that that tendency to sell things to distract people from things that would be a more productive use of their time. It distracts people from asking critical questions of themselves and of others about life. Like, are you happy with your career? Are you happy with your family? Are you happy with how things are going with your life? And these are critical questions that I think people should be encouraged to ask themselves continuously on an ongoing basis. But when shopping and things are positioned as a solution to our problems and to distract us from these questions, I think it's a world where people are walking around and they're just, it's very short-term attention span sort of thing.
Yeah, it's very you know, there's like the thinking fast and slow, like the slow thinking and the kind of immediate gratification thinking. And the capitalist system that we have right now is very much like our short-term, is like our economic system, and even our brain system. It's like triggering these very short-term like highs, whether it's like the high of buying something, the high you get of consuming fast food, the high you get from drugs. Like I spoke to a research psychologist about this, and her research area was like in food, but she was like, as you describe this to me, Maxine, the exact same thing in your brain is happening when you consume like just fashion as it is when you consume this food. It's like just this hit, this adrenaline high, and then the low that comes after. And like there's also been research around how women actually have a lot of stress, so their cortisol levels are not going like down in the day as they normally should be when they feel they have like this mess, this kind of overabundance of stuff. So there's real both in like that area of mental health, and then the social media and consumption with young people on social media, like the spikes in young people's suicide is just, it's like how it matches social media use is pretty scary. So they're like, I don't know, I feel like when we think about clothes, we think about it either in this like kind of silly or superficial, or not we, but like how it is presented often. But it goes into so much more, like not just the economy, not just history, but also like our own mental health. And that, I don't know, it's not a story that is often told, I guess.
It's true, we don't often talk about the psychology of it all and how interconnected it is to our perception, our ongoing perception of ourselves, not just how we think we feel in clothing, but how we view our value in this world.
Yeah, and because we were talking about this a little bit in preparation, but like the other thing, in another psychology researcher that I spoke to was talking about materialism, and he was saying that when you are like have economic insecurity, you actually tend to consume more because it's a way of feeling like protected from the world. And so then you like, I thought about then the Amazon worker. It's like the Amazon worker who's feeling very financially stressed. You combine that with like very cheap goods, and then we're not surprised that the average U.S. household uses their garage for stuff rather than for cars. Like, these things like feed on top of each other, and if we are to solve, like climate change, that just helped me understand, like, if we are to solve this one problem, we actually, even if we don't care about people at all, like, we have to solve the economic, inequality as well, because we simply won't be able to get there without it.
Exactly. So you touched on this earlier around the role of slavery in the industry, and you noted that cotton would not have been successful for its owners, finances, and customers without slavery, and you used the term depraved, which is a strong word to talk about the U.S. approach to turning cotton into white gold. Can you talk a little bit about why you used that term?
Yeah, so as a lawyer, words matter and definitions of words matter. And I don't think there's any, like, it means being morally corrupt. And I don't think there's anything else any other term that would be appropriate than it was a depraved means. And I think that, we tend to, like, tell the story of, like, slavery being a product of the South. But, what made very clear in the book is that it was also Northern financiers that were financing the whole thing. So it was a very interconnected, not just in the North, but in Europe as well. And in fact, the Louisiana Purchase, which is another part that was quite eye-opening to me, was funded and kind of organized by a major cotton trader. So it both deepened, the depravity of slavery, but also just helped me understand how the all of the United States was implicated, as well as kind of Europe as well. So we can't, we all have to see, our own historical roots in slavery. We can't just say like, oh, it was, bad people in the South. It was, America and the world really got behind it. And that, the other part that was was surprising to me, I didn't understand, was just like how much cotton like really drove the institution of slavery. It was like the main commodity, right? It was the main like commodity that actually pushed the institution, and it was this desire for more cotton that then, with the Louisiana Purchase, took indigenous land away. So there's major implications of our desire to have all of this clothing.
And I really appreciated you naming that in the book, because I think that in the industry, often the fight for a better industry in fashion is sort of divorced from the fight for racial justice and economic justice and gender justice. And you did a really amazing job of like just threading the needle and making those connections. So folks see that, working with like Fashion Revolution and other organizations and NSI and so forth, it's connected to the movements that are happening right here in the US and also globally as well around racial justice.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely doing the research just helped me understand very deeply how those things are all interconnected. And it's not like, it isn't like a matter of, wanting to represent like a point of view. It's like, that's just the fact, it's just the fact of like how these things are all interconnected. And I think the only way in which we can solve any of these issues is like understanding the root cause, and they all very much are interwoven together.
So let's talk about globalization. You talked about globalization in the book in relation to the story of Levi's. Can you share a little bit about that with us?
Yeah, so that was just a fascinating like story to uncover. But basically, Levi's, which did the first patent on denim, they were a big domestic producer. And the other kind of important thing to note for context is that the idea of fashion brands actually came out of factories. So it was like a way for a factory to showcase, have their mark on a product to show that like they are creating the most high quality product. So, and Levi's was very much of that ilk. They owned factories. They were a factory that happened, that then launched brands. And when, going in, even in Texas and like understanding the kind of old Garmento world, it was just a generation ago. But it was like the factories that launched these different brands. But then what happened is, as Levi's was doing their thing and had all these factories in California and Texas, there was the new game in town was Gap. And Gap originally sold Levi's, and then that was way back, they sold Levi's and vinyls. Then they got into this new game as globalization was taking off, and it wasn't just that, but Gap also helped push for this type of globalization. And so Gap was not involved with producing any clothing. They were involved with the marketing, the design, maybe, not even always. And so what they got involved in was just like, can we get this style? Can we get the SKUs? The right number of SKUs. And they were very successful with that. And so they were starting to take market share, and this was happening in denim, and this was happening like across the apparel world. And so then Levi's ultimately like became uncompetitive, and so they did the same thing, and they shut down their factories. There's no made in the U.S. Levi's anymore, and kind of followed along the path of the Gaps of the world. And I think, it still says Levi's on them, but the entire business of what they are doing has completely changed. They were a factory, and now they are, a marketing company and somewhat design. And even the CEO comes from, the latest CEO comes from the marketing world. He has no production experience, which would have been unfathomable a generation ago. So I think the Levi's is such a, it is that it is the representation of jeans, and how, what it was and what it is today is just completely changed.
When I read that part of the book, I felt sad. I felt like that was a sad pivot in the industry, because I think that there's now all these brands who exist off of marketing. You have sweatsuits, and you have clothing that literally has a logo on it, and the logo makes the price very high. And I think that that's a sad state for the industry to be in, because I think it furthers this disconnect, as I mentioned earlier, that we have with how clothing is actually made and the people who actually make the clothing, and it brings it reduces it to a product that we just have to put out there to sell to make a profit.
Yeah, and I think the other, there's this idea of full package, so people in the industry know this very well, but if something is full package, that means the brand isn't even designing it. Not only are they not producing it, the manufacturers are coming to the brand and saying hey, we think this fits your brand, we just need to get your label on it. And that's just, to me shows just how disconnected the branding, brands are from their own production. They're not just not producing it, they're not even designing it.
Yeah, it's a really sad state of affairs. So the book raises so many issues. And the question is, what do we do? And whose responsibility is it to solve the many problems that we have in the industry right now? And we know that large corporations, they often put it on the individual person. They say, if you shop secondhand, if you return your clothes to us, you'll get a discount. If you don't use water bottles, if you do this or do that, then you have the potential to make the world a better place and to change the world. But there's a certain amount of responsibility that they hold as well. Can you talk about that?
Yes. I think that what was uncovered about the oil industry, and that there was evidence that they were very purposefully pushing this whole idea that it's the individual responsibility so that they never got heat, I think is indicative of other industries as well, that you just push it on to how often you're washing your jeans as opposed to how they are actually produced. I always, it's interesting because people want to know who's responsible. Everybody's responsible, and we're all in this ecosystem together. But what I can say is if we do not raise our voice, policies will not change. And whether we think that companies should be responsible, well, they are not being responsible. And so we have to activate our sense of citizenship in that broad way. Our sense of having agency with our government representatives, because that is going to be the only way that the system changes at the speed in which it needs to change. So I don't want to say don't care about what your own individual thinks, because culture matters, but we have to change the laws. And we have, but it's not just saying oh, it's government responsibility. No, we have to engage our legislators, or get involved with organizations that are doing that. And I think that can be a scary proposition for people, and that goes back to kind of thinking about being an advocate or an organizer, or the beginning of our conversation. That's why I wanted to really get the idea across that it doesn't mean you have to change your job or like completely change who you are. It's can be very much like just a new part of one's identity to like begin to research these things, begin to read, like just have curiosity about it, and like kind of relinquish the guilt you have, because guilt isn't like a productive energy. We need to just like lean in and start to learn more and sign petitions and go to marches, and it's kind of that engagement that will be able to move the policies. And I do think the work that you personally have done, Tabitha, with the Women's March and the movement of Black Lives Matter, like, has demonstrated, I think this, like that marching, that, showing up, that calling things out, like, doesn't move things as fast as they should, but it certainly is moving things more than they were before. And so I think we need to like all take lessons from that, not say like, oh, we've done a good job, we're done. It's so not the case. But that is the process of like being in a democracy, is that we are there, that we are demanding these things, because otherwise they will not change. That's the only way we're going to like make the change necessary.
And movements are made up of individuals, of a group of people who are making decisions at the same time to push for change. So if you are thinking about doing something and you're thinking you're the only person, chances are you're not. And if you can start, then that's sort of the catalyst for others sometimes. That's something that we definitely learned at Women's March for the 2017 March. I remember there was a moment at 4 o'clock in the morning where I was like, is anybody going to show up to this march on Washington? And then 5 million people all over the world did. So it's that lesson that if you think you're alone, there's always somebody else that is probably looking for like an extra nudge as well to get involved. And the way that I think about choices in terms of the industry and clothing is that I'm sort of modeling for my children the habits around consumerism and consumption that I want them to have to be able to give birth to the world that they can create. But I think, like as you said, really advocating in terms of government and advocating in terms of big business. We make big business what it is. We make these fashion corporations what they are. We give them our power with our dollars. So I know the vote with your dollars thing is so cliche, but there's power in that, thinking about we really make them as powerful as they are because we continue to shop and we continue to consume. So we want to wrap up to leave some time for questions. Maxine, are there any last thoughts you want to share with us before we take some questions?
Thank you. And no, just thank you guys so much for being a part of this conversation, and thank you so much, Tabitha, for this, I found to be such an important conversation, and I would not have wanted to do it with anybody but you, so I'm really very honored and thanks.
Thank you for having me. Does anybody have any questions for Maxine?
You can pass the mic around. Alice, do you have any questions? Alice, you don't have to ask a question.
I can answer them quite well.
Okay, we can also just chat. So we have time for like 2 or 3 questions.
Oh, somebody has a question. Yes?
Yes.
I was just curious. I haven't finished the book, full
okay.
disclosure, but I'm halfway there. Are there any particular pieces of legislation that we should be getting behind, like now?
Thank you. I will.
She asked if there were any
Legislation.
Like a
Yes.
specific piece of legislation that we can really get behind.
Yeah, if you want
That's
to
a great
paraphrase your
question.
question, I don't have to pass the mic
Yes.
around.
So there's one that is immediate, which is the Garment Workers Center is working on. So that's like a very immediate, is going through California legislation right now. And that is to support California garment workers. So yes, that's like the most immediate need. And then we're working on legislation in New York State that would begin to incorporate those global standards that I was talking about. So it would require any company that is, not any company, but of a certain size that is selling in the New York market, which is a significant market, to abide by things like the Paris Agreement. And so it's kind of would be expanding kind of efforts that we've been doing domestically, but into any product that is entering our market. So that would be another one.
What about the PRO Act?
Oh, and, I mean, yes, like, and the PRO Act, of course. Like, there's like all of the, I mean, actual representation, like basic, I mean, so much of this goes back to like very basic things about our democracy and like voting rights. Or union efforts and organizing. So like those are things that are all kind of going through legislation right now. Thank you.
Any other questions? We're also gonna hang out and chat for a little bit.
Joe,
Yes,
did you
one more question.
It's fairly simple. What advice would you give to consumers to like sum up the book and like help them make decisions based on being more sustainable?
Advice for consumers?
Yeah.
So first, it's interesting because the question is asked like consumers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think even that like language choice is an interesting one and triggers things when we say like the consumer, because I was interviewing a psychologist about this, and he's like, when you even use the word consumer, it actually triggers people to consume. And so I think like reframing it, and Tabitha and I have had big discussions. Citizen is obviously like a weighted term for other reasons.
I actually liked what you said earlier. You said
being.
person with agency.
Person with agency, yes. So I think like that, you know, just reframing like what our whole role is in this society is like is a starting point. And then I don't know, the one thing that I always go back in my mind is so Accra in Ghana is where like the secondhand market that I got to explore for the book, and it was like the most stylish city that I have ever been to, and I felt so uncool. But I realized that you know, and I spoke to a lot of like shoppers in Accra, and I was surprised that like everybody participated in the secondhand market, like regardless of socioeconomic status, they were all going there or purchasing from it. And so when I asked like, well, why wouldn't you just like buy stuff at the mall, or like, isn't there more status at the mall? You know, they said like, why would I want something that everybody else can have? And then I like later in my room like connected the dots. It's like, oh, that's why people are so stylish, because like they actually have their own style. It's like their own thing, rather than like what, you know, coming from Minnesota, which is like the Mall of America. You know, we were like sold on style, on like what that style should be. So I think like really, I don't know, engaging in fashion like in a true sense is actually a very much more sustainable thing to do, because it will ultimately slow us down, because it won't be about like just the status. It's like what we're actually trying to show off in the world. So I think just kind of that from an individual basis, but then also like getting back to like, don't just see yourself as a consumer. Like this is something that you are being sold on that is ultimately just like making a bunch of like white dudes rich. Like get involved with like policy and you know, start to engage in that. So both sides.
Thank you, everyone.
This has been wonderful, and like I said, the book is amazing, and you can order it from McNallyJackson.com. You can go on our website, and because the garden is not for profit, which I'm going to turn it over to Joe for just a minute, because they were kind enough to allow us to use this wonderful space. And this is, as she said, this is the third attempt. We were rained out twice, as a lot of you must know. So I will let Joe say a few words about the garden. And like I said, McNally Jackson was very honored to host this event tonight. We appreciate it. Here we go, Joe. Yeah.
Thanks, Yvonne. Yeah, so we're used to getting rained out with a lot of events. So we're used to dealing with all of that, but I'm really glad it came together. It was really, I was listening from over there, but I could hear you. And it was fascinating, so thank you for that. Yeah, so we're fighting to save this space. The city wants to turn it into a mixed-use building when they have much better alternatives in there that they're ignoring. So we've been in a lengthy 8+ year battle to a political and now legal battle to save the space. We have tons of events here, events like this. We also have our own poetry events, live music, and educational workshops with the local public schools as well. So it's very much a center for the community as well as a community garden, and we're really fighting hard to save it. So if you're interested in helping that or helping spread the word or in any way contributing, we have information at the table over there. We're open 7 days a week and we're open through the winter. So I always say the best way to protest the city's plans is to enjoy the space and celebrate the space. So we're here, and thank you so much for coming. And thank you for supporting the garden.
Thank you, everyone.